Good morning. Hello. Welcome everybody to our shared National Child Day event brought to you by both the Public Health Agency of Canada Regional Office in Ontario, and hopefully I said that right, Blanca, you can correct me, and our Ontario network of CAPC and CPNP projects. We're here today in celebration of National Child Day. Really just delighted to have you all here. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will see this event does have closed captioning. So if you would like to have subtitles, you just need to click on closed captioning and show subtitles. And I think I will turn that on here for the recording as well. Show subtitles. And the second thing is, I was just mentioning that there is a Canada-wide emergency alert going out, but in Ontario, not till apparently 12:55. So, but I thought I would give everybody that little heads up because I know I appreciate knowing my cell phones are going to screech at me at some point today. So with those housekeeping pieces out of the way, I'd love to just kick things off here and start in a good way by taking some time to give gratitude and thanks to the land that we live and work and play on, and to those who have been the traditional keepers and stewards. As a settler Canadian myself, I like to acknowledge the benefits I receive and express the thankfulness I feel to live and work where I do. We have people here today from all over the province and perhaps some from further away. I'm located in Southwest Ontario in an area known as the Haldimand Tract, the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I'm learning that this is Treaty 4 land, and there's more that I need to learn about that. But I've also learned that, that there are more than 40 treaties and other land agreements all across Ontario. I was taught when I sort of began this unlearning of colonization that it's important for all of us, including and especially settler Canadians, to recognize that we are all treaty people. Many people think that treaty rights are special Indigenous rights, and I know I've held some of those beliefs, but if we recognize that all people living in Canada are treaty people with our own sets of rights and responsibilities. And it's interesting to think about, what if we all recognize treaties as a foundational part of Canadian society? So I invite you to think about that and consider that the existence of treaties tell us that the first settlers of what is now Canada respected First Nations as sovereign people and negotiated nation to nation. So it's relatively easy to find out if the land you live and work on is treaty territory, and I'll put a link in the chat to help you explore that. So with that, again, welcome to our National Child Day celebration. And I want to hand things over to Blanca to introduce the folks who are bringing greetings.
Thanks, Sydney. Good morning, everybody. It's so great to see such a wonderful group joining us to celebrate National Child Day. Well, National Child Day is actually November 20th, but we always like to have it a little bit early, recognizing that people may have their own celebrations to be at on the day of, or the day before. So it's great that you're able to join us. This is such an special event for our team at our regional Ontario office for PHAC. We recognize every year this day to highlight the work that our programs do, recognizing that National Child Day is a celebration of Canada's commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that CAPC-CPNP is part of that commitment. And so we always like to profile the work of our programs, our projects. Since last year, we were able to collaborate with the CAPC CPNP network and come together for this celebration. So we hope you enjoy the event and that you're able to also participate in other local events and celebrations in your communities. I also want to welcome all our other projects from across the country. We'll have projects here from all over Canada. And I see some of our colleagues from national office, which is great to have you here. Thank you for coming. And now without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Sobia Ali. Sobia is the acting senior manager for the public health programs unit at our office. And she's gonna have some greetings for us. Thanks, Sobia.
Thanks, Blanca. And thank you everybody for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on this important day. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And as some of you know, that CAPC CPNP is also reaching towards that important milestone soon, because these programs were launched back in 1992 as part of Canada's commitment to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And since the beginning of CAPC CPNP and Aboriginal Head Start the projects have been providing vital services to children and families, especially the ones living in disadvantaged conditions. And some of you might not know that in Ontario, we have allocated 30% of our overall program funding for Indigenous-led organizations to provide services to Indigenous children and families. And our goal was always to empower Indigenous organizations to provide culturally responsive programs in their communities. And the goals and objectives of these programs were relevant back 30 years ago, and they're still applicable in this current environment. For example, during this current COVID pandemic, our projects were quickly able to adapt and mobilize in their communities, moving from in-person to online programming, and in some cases to a hybrid model of both online and in-person programs. And all this work was and it really is possible because of the dedication of all of you who are working in these programs, whether it's the executive directors, program managers, frontline workers, each and every one of you is making valuable contributions to CAPC CPNP and Aboriginal Head Start. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for your commitment and all the amazing work that you're doing in your projects. Finally, I also want to thank you to my dedicated and committed team of program consultants for always putting children and families first in our day-to-day work. I really appreciate everybody who worked and put together this event. And I hope that you have a great event and happy National Child's Day.
Thank you, Sobia. And now I'd like to introduce Kim Grossklag. Kim is co-chair of our CAPC CPNP Ontario network.
Thank you, Blanca. As you said, my name is Kim Grossklag, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Ontario network of the CAPC and CPNP projects. As Blanca said, I'm currently one of the co-chairs of this network. And we are so very excited today to be partnering with the PHAC Regional Office to bring you this event. There are 170 CAPC and CPNP projects in Ontario that are part of this network. And again, we all work with vulnerable families. So National Child Day and children's rights are so very important to all of us. We work hard to support vulnerable families in a variety of ways. I always say there's no two CAPC CPNP projects alike, just as there is, every community has its own characteristics, and we all work to support the community's families in the ways that they need. And This support not only helps to create environments where children can grow and reach their full potential, but it also recognizes and promotes that children have the right to do this. So once again, welcome, and we are so glad that you have joined us for this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim and Sobia and Blanca. It's a really great way to start our time together. And now it's my real pleasure to introduce Angela to you. She's going to take us through some learnings. And Angela is no stranger to the network and to CAPC and CPNP. We always enjoy when she's able to be with us and share of her wisdom and insight. So Dr. Angela Mashford Pringle, she's an assistant professor, associate director, Indigenous Health Lead at Lead-Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health. So welcome, Angela.
Thank you so much, Sydney and Sobia and Kim. Thank you for getting us going, and Blanca. So I'm just going to get my screen up. Get us started here. Unfortunately, I put the chat over top of it, so it's taking me extra long to do this morning.
Worries. You're good now. That looks good.
All right. So I am from Timiskaming First Nation in Northern Quebec. And as Sydney told you, I am an assistant professor and the associate director of the Lead-Waakebiness-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health. So I'm an Algonquin scholar, and for just over 10 years, I worked for the Public Health Agency of Canada and Health Canada. So I've worked in CAPC, CPNP, and Aboriginal Head Start, as well as the adult health team, which I was working in Hep C, HIV, AIDS, and then I moved over into tobacco cessation. So yes, I'm very aware of the work that all of you do and how important it is. So that's a little bit about me. I'm sure we'll get to that in just a second. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If I'm saying something and you're not sure, or if you just want to ask a question, please feel free to pop in right away, because it's sometimes better if I can say things as we're going, as opposed to me trying to answer all your questions at the end. And sometimes it's nicer to get your question answered early when you're thinking about it. So who are we as Indigenous people? Well, I'm sure you already know about, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but I want you to start thinking about how we see ourselves as Indigenous people. So thinking of our traditional teachings from our ancestors, thinking about how our languages and our cultures and our ceremonies are intrinsically intertwined with our identities, with our self-determination, our self-governance, and with everything that we do. So I've put pictures here of the top picture is me as a baby, and the bottom pictures are my mom and her sister as young girls. And the reason I did that is I want you to think that over centuries of, like, generation after generation, we've managed to make sure that our cultural ways, our ceremonies, our histories, they get passed down from generation to generation. And that's incorporated in such a way that it's central to who we are as Indigenous people. And it's important, because if you don't have that, then it's really hard for you to determine where you're going or what you're doing. So as we're going to talk a little bit about child welfare, I want you to just keep this in mind, that all of these things are central to who we are and where we want to be and where we want to go. In addition to that, our language is really important. I'm sure you've heard a lot about Indigenous languages, but inside of our languages, there's like a whole story going on where English doesn't allow you to actually have that story. It's really difficult to use English to tell some of the teachings that we have, and there's nuances within our Indigenous languages that really doesn't get explained in English. So for example, if I was telling my kids, or my mom was telling me about plants and medicines and how we find them and how we prepare them, there's something about the teaching in our language that's different. And it also helps you to think about the world in a different way because you're learning in a different language. So anybody that's a dual language holder, you automatically understand this because you see the world through your dominant language, and then you may have to flick between languages. So it's important to have both, and you have different understandings of something based on which language you're thinking or being in. So this is all important in terms of, you know, what's happened to Indigenous people in Canada and where we're headed. So again, here's a big, an old picture of my granny and my grandpa, and they're like my great grandfather and great grandmother, and all of the children. And actually, now I just see my great great grandmother's there. I didn't even notice she was there. She's hidden with the kids. Anyway, so, you know, knowing where you come from and knowing who you are is very important. And family for Indigenous people is somewhat different than for other communities where they live in a nuclear family. They don't live in an extended family. So growing up, my aunts, my mom is the oldest of 9. We ended up being with all of my aunts and uncles all the time. They may not have lived in our house, but they were so close that they may have lived in our house. All my cousins, they lived close by too. So I was forever seeing my cousins and we were doing things together. And if something was wrong, you could go to your aunts or your uncles and ask for help instead of going to your parents. So the way that we treat family is different than, say, the Western way of thinking of family, which is very nuclear. The other thing is because we live so close to each other, you know, whether it was a car ride, a streetcar ride, or a bus ride, it was still relatively cheap and easy to get to one another. And yes, I grew up in the city, so you can tell all my family moved away from our community and came to the city. But it made it so that I could have a relationship with all of my aunts and uncles and with my cousins as we were aging. And this is really important because before I started post-secondary, I never thought of the things that I was being taught as teachings. This seems to be a newer word, I think, and maybe more in academics than anywhere. When I'm getting knowledge, traditional knowledge, it's just passed on to you while you're doing something. And nowadays people are having to put traditional teachings online, or they have to write them down because it's not being taught in communities, because the communities are starting to be either more mobile or they're not as connected as they once were. So why am I telling you this? Well, for non-Indigenous families, they may always have had to have teaching. So that's why we have schools. This is why we have to make time to teach some of the everyday things that we don't even think about. You know, when you want to teach a child to knit or to work on a car or to create something, you have to spend the time to give them that space to do that. Whereas before, that may have been just embedded in our family lives. So the other thing is, if you notice, there are people of all different ages in my family in this picture, and they all have different roles. They're all very complex, and everybody's expected to be part of keeping the family moving forward. So, you know, some people will be hunting, some people will be berry picking, some people will be building canoes, others will be looking after children, others might be going to get water. So everybody had a role, everybody knew what they needed to do, and it wasn't necessarily gendered roles, but rather the community's well-being roles. So the difference in the way that we think about families is very important. And as you could probably see, you know, husbands and wives, whether they were Indigenous or not, were brought in and they were expected to take on the roles that the family needed. This didn't change over generations. I can say in the 2 generations that happened after my grandparents, the same thing has happened. Anybody that comes into the family is expected to take on roles that they may not have thought they were going to have to take on. So language and culture are very much key determinants of early childhood development, in the sense that all of our worldviews are based on our languages and our cultures. So when you're working with Indigenous children, it's really important that you know what kind of language or culture that they feel connected to. In that regard, you know, in Ontario, there's the 6 Mohawk communities in southwestern Ontario. There's Cree, there's Ojibwe, there's Anishinaabe, there's Potawatomi, Odawa, Ottawas, Algonquin. We have so many different languages and so many different cultures in our province, and our province has artificial boundaries that say it ends in Quebec and ends in New York State, but that's not true. And so for some of us, we have relatives that go off into the States and off into other provinces. So thinking of that and thinking of the landscape, that's where our languages and our cultures come from. It's our ancestors' interactions with those places and spaces, and they started to understand what they needed to do to keep the land healthy and to keep ourselves healthy. And in turn, that keeps generation after generation healthy. So understanding our language and our culture comes from the land, and our interactions with the land is hugely important. I often tell students to think about where did you come from and what's your connection to the land you came from? And what does that mean? Have you heard the stories of the land from which your ancestors came from? Because I bet you there are gems of knowledge that you may be interested in exploring and using in your own family. So, you know, children look at the world around them based on what adults in their world do. So if we're speaking our languages and we're doing our cultural practices, then they will pick up on those and they will just start to understand what they are. So for a lot of our communities, we have a lot of ceremonies. There's often a lot of fire and a lot of food. And I think that's true of a lot of different communities, but for First Nations communities in particular, it's really important to have food and a place to sit and gather, usually in a circle, so that nobody is above you, nobody's below you, and everybody's beside you, so that we can support one another. So some of the ceremonies that I've experienced in First Nations in Ontario and Quebec are very different than what I see in mainstream and when I had my own children. I think about this now and I think nobody had a Tikanagan ceremony for me. So usually you would, you know, one of your family members would create the moss bag or the Tikanagan for you to use. And then, you know, there'd be a whole ceremony where people would have food and drink and the baby gets placed in there. And, you know, there's discussions about what kind of adornments need to go on it to keep the baby safe. And sometimes that's when they would have your naming ceremony is when you got your Tikanagan. So it just depended on the community. Placenta ceremony, some people know what that is. For a lot of First Nations communities, at least, having the placenta and then burying it in a place where you can either watch a tree grow or a garden flourish tells you a lot about the child. So in different communities, the planting of the placenta kind of gives you a sense of direction where the child's going to go. And when I say that, you're probably going, what? So if the tree grows up very straight but doesn't have a lot of branches, it means that child's going to have a very straightforward path in life. And the more branches are the more options the child has to take or will take. This is not to say that, you know, this is good or bad. It's just that that's what one of the teachings is. My cousin lives in a Cree community and they have two ceremonies that I'd never experienced before. One is the first smile ceremony. So when a young child has their first smile, everybody gathers, within the next day or two, and they have a feast together, and they talk about, that this young child is now starting to see their world and is happy being here, and that's why they're smiling. So it's a chance for the community to come together, to hold the baby, to try to get a smile. I think it's awesome because the child then gets to know more people in the family. A walking out ceremony is when a toddler starts to learn to walk. When you think they're going to be able to take their first steps, you organize everybody to come. You have a feast and a giveaway, and the child is asked to try to walk out of the home. In traditional times, it would have been out of our wigwams or our teepees or our other traditional structures. Nowadays, it would be out of your home. But then it's celebrated, so the child knows that this is good, and this means that they're now starting to understand their independence. That's what walking out ceremonies are about. And yes, most people in non-Indigenous communities would be going, but that's a 2-year-old or however young they are. So how would they know what that means to be independent? But it does. The child then starts to show their own personalities, and there's a whole bunch of ceremonies after this. But these are things that I learned when I've been with the Cree communities, is that if you do that, then they start to understand that it's okay to be out in the outside world, and they don't need to have the family surrounding them all the time, that they need to explore and be people, little people at that. When I work with the Mohawk communities, they have taught me about the little people. So they have ceremonies about when you get rid of your teeth and your hair, and your nail clippings and other personal pieces. So they tell me that the little people need to be fed. And so they recommend putting, when you lose a tooth as a child, the children are supposed to take it outside in order to put it out for the little people, because that's what they live on, is teeth and clippings of hair. I don't have the entire ceremony, nor do I have all the teachings around that. I'm just saying there are ceremonies for this. Why are ceremonies important? Because this is another way of entrenching First Nations culture into our families and our communities, and specifically into our children's lives, and making sure that they can pass on these teachings to the next generation. With that being said, we do have traditional adoption or kinship adoption, depending on where you're located. And this happens in many different communities across Canada, even today. Probably less so than it did in the past, but if somebody is unable to look after their children, we used to just hand them to another family member. So I can give you an example of this, sort of. When my mom was born, she was born to an unwed First Nations woman in 1950. And this is just prior to all of the changes to the Indian Act. First of all, it was already not good, and there was so much racism that my grandmother was afraid that she would lose my mom. And she had older sisters who had children already. So she passed my mom off as, she asked her sisters to take my mom for the first few years of her life, because they didn't want her to be stolen in what becomes the 60s scoop. But back then they didn't know that was what it was called. They just were afraid that she would end up in foster care. And so that's kind of like a kinship adoption, where my great aunties raised my mom for the first 6 years of her life. By then my grandmother had gotten married, and so she brought her back home. And it's ironic, nobody ever checked to find out where this kid just came from, because they didn't live right next to each other. They lived in neighboring towns, if you will. So I just think it's kind of interesting to see. And there are other kinship adoptions. Elders often will, adopt somebody into a community, and they're either, whether they're a young person or an adult, and they're brought in to be Shkikbewis, which is a helper. And then they get to learn the traditions and the ceremonies and the knowledge that goes along with that person that's adopting them in. It's also tricky in the sense that if we have child welfare issues going on within a family, other family members can step up, but this is not while it's recognized by provincial and territorial governments, it's not always easy to do. Even in Nunavut, where it was traditional to have your firstborn child of a family go to the grandparents of the maternal grandparents, it's still not easy to make it understandable to people. So this idea of traditional adoption, while it's happening, I'm not sure that the governments are actually aware of what's happening. Sometimes it's not written in paper. Any family member can adopt or care for a child or another family member. And they're really, from my knowledge, that's not to say that I know everything. There's often no formal agreement, which can cause problems later. And so I have a cousin, his parents passed away in a fire when he was a baby, and another family member adopted him and just changed his name because he was still a baby and wouldn't know it, and they couldn't have children. And so he grew up with a name that, he knows, but it's not his actual name. And so that became a problem as he started to get older and trying to figure out who he was, because there was papers left behind saying that his parents had passed away and that he was raised by somebody else. And so, as an adult with your parents gone and your adopted parents gone, how do you figure out who you are? And so it's an interesting thing that there was no written agreement after his parents passed. So this brings us to the things that most people already know. There are tons of inter and intragenerational traumas. The Indian Act and all the amendments are part of that. The residential schools, which I'm sure many people have heard a lot about in the last 5 or 6 months. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 60s scoop and the millennial scoop. And if you've never heard about it, the pass system is another big issue, where they used to prevent us from going from place to place without having this nice pass. And I liken it to COVID right now, where people are going, but why do I need a vaccine passport? Because you need to be able to tell people what you're doing and that you're vaccinated. I think it's the same thing. It's not necessarily easy, and it's not necessarily the best thing. It's not as strict and enforced as the pass system was, but still absolutely necessary for us to be healthy and well in today's society. We had Indian hospitals. This happens to be the old Sioux Lookout Hospital. And the Indian hospitals, depending on how you want to situate it, weren't exactly sources of health and well-being. They were just sources of treatment, and sometimes mistreatment. We have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons. And right now we have a school to prison pipeline that's going on, and I'll talk about that too. And then as Sydney started us out, she was talking about treaties, and we need to talk about, the treaties. I'm not going to today, but we need to start talking about the treaties and the systemic and institutional racism that were built within it. I know today in the news, if you have a chance to look, if you look up A.R. Kaufman, you will find out he was a eugenicist who lived in southwestern Ontario, specifically in the Kitchener area. And he paid for academics and healthcare professionals to actually do something about eugenics in Ontario. And he was part of a eugenics movement in society, and he did a lot of philanthropy in that area. So today, Waterloo Region District School Board is going to change schools that have that name A.R. Kaufman on them. Why is that important? Because that starts to recognize that we've had these detrimental things happening in our society for generations. It's not just today. It wasn't just a one-off thing, but rather it's been happening for quite some time. So residential schools, I want to say first, I heard Kim speaking, and I've come to change my language. Instead of saying people are vulnerable, I call them made vulnerable. And there's a reason for that. Inherently, these children, these people, anybody that's called, that gets classified as vulnerable, they didn't do that to themselves. It's our systems that have made them vulnerable. So I've started to change the way I look at statistics. It's helped me to change the way that I, read things, and I start to think about, well, what made these people live in poverty? What made these people live in a health crisis or a water crisis? It's not the community or the individual themselves that have placed themselves at risk, but rather our systems have placed them there. Therefore, I call them made vulnerable instead of vulnerable. So when I think about poverty, and we have almost half of First Nations children living in poverty compared to 12% of non-Indigenous children, this is problematic. When you start to think about child welfare laws, generally speaking, when you live in poverty, you're more likely to be on the radar of child welfare. And that can cause them to come in to check on your children more frequently or for different causes because they were afraid they're not getting enough food or they don't have adequate shelter. So this can change the way that a child grows up. It also changes the amount of opportunities they're afforded. It also changes their trajectory in terms of being able to understand certain parts of the world because they're not offered opportunities they would be if they weren't living in poverty. The health crisis, we're looking at Indigenous people, First Nations people, and Métis people less so than Inuit, but still the same. We have a life expectancy that's 10 to 15 years less than non-Indigenous people in Canada. So if the life expectancy for an First Nations woman is 70 years, then it's like 78 or 80 years for non-Indigenous. It really is a huge concern because that means right from birth, you're already going to have a shorter life than others, which means you have to use your time very wisely. And we have to be concerned with other factors like COVID or infectious diseases or chronic diseases, also lowering the life expectancy. We have a major water crisis in Canada. 400 of the 618 First Nations this year or last year were under at least one water advisory. There's 58 across Canada long-term drinking water advisories. And of those 58, I believe 21 of them are here in Ontario. We have the worst track record for lifting water advisories. We lift them and they're back on within weeks. So don't let the government fool you. Sorry, government people. Don't let the government fool you into believing that the crisis is anywhere near close to being done. Places like Gull Bay in Northern Ontario, they've been on a water advisory since 1969. So we're talking quite a long time. They've come off. And what happens is the government resets the clock every time they bring them off for any length of time, even though it could be only for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. There is a huge language crisis. We only have 15% of our Indigenous communities able to speak their language at home. It's more likely that if you're Inuit, that you would be speaking your language than if you were First Nations or Métis. Now, if you've ever read the RCMP's Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, you'll see these statistics that there's only 1,181 Indigenous female victims of homicide in Canada between 1980 and 2014. I'm here to tell you that they underrepresented those numbers based on what they were doing. They don't check in Canada your indigeneity when you are born anymore, and they don't check your indigeneity when you die in Canada, if they ever did. So this is based on clearly visible Indigenous people dying, and it's also based on the families of the people that were victims of homicide. So if they don't report them as Indigenous, and in some cases nobody's there as a family to claim this person, then they're not showing up in the RCMP rolls. In estimations that different scholars have looked at, it's roughly about 5,000 or more Indigenous women and girls that have been murdered or are missing to present day. And in fact, the last number I heard was somewhere around 8,000. And this is climbing steadily. We're seeing people being murdered and going missing every day. Human trafficking is a huge issue for Indigenous women. And, you know, Robert Pickton, was a serial killer, and took quite a few Indigenous women. So we have to think about all of these things in behind child welfare that are going on. Why? Because this is affecting why you'd be part of child welfare. So the slogan that used to be bantered around in government circles was "Kill the Indian and save the child." And as you can see here on this flyer, as of August, 5,800 kids were found in mass graves at different residential schools. The last number I just saw yesterday was around 11,000, and I think it's still growing because they're still doing all of the different monitoring at the different schools right now. And so this is going to continue to grow. They're doing it in the United States and in Canada, so we're going to see these numbers grow. The other thing is, you know, this only represents the people that were the Indigenous children that died when they were at residential schools. This doesn't represent the ones that escaped and died on their way home, like Cheney Wenjack. So when we see these numbers, everybody goes, oh, that's a past history thing. Some of those schools didn't close till the 70s, and I can't guarantee you that some of those bodies aren't from a more recent time. And I'm not sure we'll ever know that. But irregardless of that, it is still a high number. That's a lot of children to lose over a few generations. And we wonder why we have this problem with trying to work with governments when this is happening and behind the scenes. So, you know, there was a lot going on in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that lead into why we have Indigenous child welfare issues. First of all, the schools were expensive, hugely expensive, the residential schools. And so they were trying to figure out ways to get around residential schools. Their big thing was, we need to find another way to separate Indigenous children from their families in order for them to, you know, be assimilated into Western society or Canadian society. So after World War II, Canada also had this idea of social welfare state, where everybody there should be some social safety net, so people don't die of hunger, people have access to healthcare, the justice system represents the majority, so on and so forth. And what you're seeing on the right is the original Indian Act, and what it said. You know, this act may be cited as the Indian Act, and it tells you who we are. And you can see just a few things. I didn't want to give you the whole Indian Act, it's quite long. But, you know, just even the idea that there is an act in Canada that tells us who are First Nations and who aren't, and describes or defines these pieces, tells you a lot about why child welfare becomes an issue. So in 1951, they decided to make huge changes to the Indian Act. So for First Nations people who were banned from any of their ceremonies, that the bans came off, so they could go back to using Sundance and potlatch and other things. They could wear their regalia again. Indigenous women could then have the right to vote in their band council elections, and we could have lawyers again. We hadn't had lawyers since the 1927 amendments to the Indian Act. So this is a huge deal. And the final thing that really happens with the changes in 1951 are that child welfare governance goes from being a federal responsibility under the Indian Act to the provinces, because the provinces had child welfare agencies already established. So you may, you know them as children's aid societies or child welfare, but those provincial standards, they didn't ever go into First Nations communities. They didn't know anything about what I was talking about earlier in terms of what a family looks like or what happens in a family. And now you have these social workers who are being told to go into First Nations communities and check on children. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So this is where, they would be coming in, and they wouldn't have any cultural safety training. They may never have even seen an Indigenous person before. And they are only called into the communities technically, although I'm going to tell you a story after this. But usually they were called in by the RCMP or a police agency, sometimes by a health professional or a teacher, and sometimes by the Indian agent. And yes, there were Indian agents up until the 1960s. So they could ask them to come in and check on a family based on something that they saw or believed. Now, I'm going to tell you this little story, and then you can take it for what you want. In my own family, my mom always cleaned on Fridays, and I never understood it. And then when I first started teaching at U of T, and I had a whole bunch of Indigenous students, we had this discussion one day, and we found out that we all had a cleaning day. And I didn't understand the significance of having a cleaning day until we started talking about it. It was so that when the social worker would come to our houses to check on how clean is your house? How clean are the kids? Do you have food? Are the clothes clean? That was the reason why we were cleaning on a certain day of the week. And we all had a different one, because that would tell you when the social worker went from one community to the next. So when you're working with Indigenous families, you may find that they're worried about you coming in because they're afraid you're going to do the same things social workers will do to them. They're afraid you're going to tell them their children aren't clean. They're afraid you're going to tell them that they don't have enough food. They're afraid that you're going to tell them that their house isn't clean enough or it's not big enough. These are all things that take children away in mainstream child welfare. So there is that sense of fear, and there is that sense of, I don't want to call it shame. It's more, it is really a fear, but it's more not wanting to show what's going on, not because of fear or anything, but in defiance in some ways. Because every time that the government would interact with Indigenous people, it always seemed to turn out in a bad way. And that's not to say that there aren't people then and now who are trying to do good work for Indigenous people. But because the majority wasn't, there's this fear that it's always going to turn out bad. So currently, Indigenous children represent 7.7% of all children in Canada under the age of 15 in like all of our population, but they are 52.5% of our entire foster care system. And I believe that number is still relatively the same, although I could not find more current numbers than 2016. And why is this important? So think about that. We only represent 7% of the population, but we're more than 50% of the children in foster care. That's enormous. That's enormous, right? We're more than half of the kids, but we don't even represent like 1/10 of the kids in Canada. So this is where we start to think about how disproportionately child welfare is affecting Indigenous children versus non-Indigenous children. There's this need to have culturally competent social workers and service providers. That includes you guys, because a lot of the parents are going to come to you and want to do programs that will help them, when they do have a social worker come. So they need to understand what they need to be doing. It may be also, I'm not saying it's your job, and I hope it will be my job, and I am working on this, is to have courses for social workers and service providers so they understand their responsibilities and what the history has been, because they may not understand the fear. They may not understand, the ethics of non-interference, which is part of being a First Nations parent. We believe in letting our children do things and try them, not harmful things, but go climb a tree, it's okay. Go run around the neighborhood, it's okay. Whereas there's this fear in our society that kids shouldn't be climbing trees without support, or they can't really run around the streets because some monster might come get them. but we've created this artificially, and there's no statistics to back it up. Yes, there are things happening, and yes, when a child is taken and kidnapped, it's horrible and it makes national news. But take a look at how many kids there are in the world and how often that happens. I'm not saying to dismiss it, but we also have to be realistic that it's not an everyday occurrence everywhere. And if you're in a park and your kid is 100 feet away and they're playing, is that any different than you sitting on your front porch and they're running up and down your street? So again, it's how comfortable our society is with things and what we think are relevant or not relevant in terms of safety and care. And that also gets into why these kids end up in child welfare. There's still birth alerts happening in Ontario and actually across Canada. They said they've stopped them, but I've heard even this summer that in some places in Ontario, there were children taken because a birth alert was given. So if you don't know what a birth alert is, that is when a social worker or another service provider alerts the hospital, or vice versa. The hospital alerts social workers that somebody is going to be, an Indigenous person is going to have a child, and they're at the hospital for when the birth happens, and they take the baby right away. They don't even give them a chance to necessarily meet their child before they take them. The argument is they may have been doing drugs or alcohol. Some of them may say that they've already got children in child welfare and they're afraid for their safety, so they want to take them before the mom even has a chance to bond or be with them. And so birth alerts are very discriminatory, and at least in my opinion, are very racist, because they are only happening to a select number of people. They don't happen across the board for everybody in the same way. And when you start to look at the number of Indigenous children in child welfare, it tells me that it's happening more often for Indigenous children than it is non-Indigenous children. Our current system of child welfare really becomes an extension of the residential schools. Instead of sending children off to residential schools, you're taking them away so that they, for the most part, end up in non-Indigenous families where they're going to not learn their culture and language and their worldviews. So back in 2007, I'm not going to describe everything. I just want to show you this timeline because this is really important. Back in 2007, Cindy Blackstock, the Assembly of First Nations, and Cindy Blackstock's organization's First Nations Child Family Caring Society put in a complaint against the federal government to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in order to get the funding for child welfare and Jordan's Principle funded at an appropriate level. So you've got to think, I want you to think now, 2007, we're in 2021. And Canadians always ask me, well, why are you so angry? Why are you pushing so hard? If it was in 2007, they filed this, and we're in 2021, and the government's still appealing this, which is what you're going to find out in a second. Is it really so bad that we're angry and that we're trying really hard to push people to see what's going on that the government does in behind the scenes? So what you'll see here is that every time they get some kind of judgment that the government should be paying for Indigenous child welfare, the federal government keeps pushing back, or they say that they're not liking the documents. There's tons of things going on in the interim. So again, we started in 2007. By 2015, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Report. We also have an Aboriginal Children in Care report that went to the premiers. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal finds in favor of Cindy Blackstock and the Assembly of First Nations. That's 2016. So it took from 2007 to 2016, because of all the back and forth legal stuff, to get to a yes, you're right. Then the federal government says they're going to implement Jordan's Principle in 2016, but they don't. They say it, but they don't. They have yet to give it any legal legs. They've agreed to it in principle, but it doesn't have the legal legs to make anything happen. And then we start to see from here on in, what you're going to see is every time they've been asked to comply, third non-compliance, fourth non-compliance, they go back and they redo all of the funding for it in 2019. So now we're up to 12 years since it started, and we still don't have any funding going out. We have the murdered and missing Indigenous girls final report go out in 2019. They have Bill C-92, which is an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, go out in 2019. And yet, even after signing this act, they still don't comply. They still do not give the money. And as of the last month, they appealed one more time because they didn't want to pay the compensation that was assigned through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. This is after 10 appeals by the federal government. Why am I telling you this? Because this also affects Indigenous child welfare in a big way. It also affects how you may be interacting with Indigenous people, because whether you're trying to follow it, the federal government may be pushing back on what you're allowed to do or not do. And this is where we really need allies to stand up and say, hey, we're going to make changes. Just because the federal government doesn't want to do it doesn't mean we as individuals or we as organizations can't do that. So part of the other piece that I see happening as child welfare is going on is not just your 0 to 6-year-olds, it's all the way up to 18. We have this tendency to now move our youth into cities to get a high school education. So I don't know how many of you are even aware in Ontario that I would say 30 of the 100 remote communities in Northern Ontario have to send their kids south to Thunder Bay or to Timmins, or a few send them down to North Bay or Sudbury. But they have to send them south because there's no high school in their community. And the only way they're going to get an education is if they leave. Well, I don't know, if you've got a 13-year-old, can you think about sending your 13-year-old away, like 1,000 kilometers away from you, when they're about to hit puberty, when they're about to try the most risky behaviors because they don't have somebody watching them? That's what's happening. And then what happens is they're in a city and somebody calls it in, whether it's the school or the family that they're billeting with, and then they end up in child welfare. And it's not because the parents were neglectful. It's not because the kid is being anything but exploratory, sometimes in a bad way, but still exploratory. It's the age, right? This is when you explore. And then what happens is they don't just take your teenager. If you've got other children, they start to look at, well, you must be a bad parent if this kid is acting out while they're in the city. But I don't know too many 13, 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who can live alone away from their families at such a formative time. This is when you actually are trying to figure out who you are. You are pushing the boundaries. But if you're going to send them down to cities to get this education and they're not with their families and they're pushing the boundaries, is it fair for social workers to then go into our communities and take away the other kids that you have because one child acted out? I don't think so, but that's what's happening. It's also at a time when most kids are learning. This is actually when they learn how to parent, right? And now they're not in their homes. They're not there to see their parents parent them. They're not there to see their grandparents parent them. They're not getting advice from their aunties, their uncles, or their cousins. So this is changing the next generation. So we not only lost generations to residential schools in the 60s scoop, but now we're starting to lose them to what I consider the new scoop. So this new scoop, the millennial scoop, it starts with the 60s scoop, where they were taking kids and they were, hand over fist, making money, in my opinion, from what I can see. We had the pass system going on. We had other assimilation policies, including the Indian Act, the idea that we couldn't use our cultures or our languages in mainstream areas. And for many of us, we were told to not tell people that we were Indigenous if we didn't have to. If there's any way that you could pass as something other than than First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, you were told to do that. And that continued right up until the 2000s. I think in the 90s, it started to become a little more acceptable to be Indigenous, but even my experience, well into the 2000s, I was still experiencing a lot of racism. And I'm more white passing than others. And so I have to think that that has a lot to do with why we see child welfare the way it is, because they're looking at Indigenous people as chronically in trauma and always in need of help. And so social workers and child welfare systems start to go, well, we need to help these people. And what does that look like? And so they continually try to offer help and assistance. So this has affected parents and caregivers, families and communities, and it's internalized trauma. And I call it inter and intra-generational trauma, because it's not just happening from one generation to the next, it's happening from like brothers to sisters or sister to sister. It's not just passing down from parent to child. So to me, there's a piece that keeps getting missed when people just talk about intergenerational trauma. There's something about how siblings interact with each other, how cousins interact with each other, that also causes trauma. And it's also, the scoops that have happened are also changing who we are. And, people don't necessarily know their identity because they were scooped at a young age. So they don't have the connection to community. So that's, there's fights about what Indigenous identity is right now. But we are resilient. We are resisting. I couldn't find what I was looking for, so I found this plant growing out of a piece of pavement. But what I am hearing a lot of is our traditional plants, like sima or tobacco, are starting to reclaim places in cities. So they're growing up. And people are like, what is that? Oh, it's some kind of weed, and they pull it. But what they don't realize is it's actually tobacco growing because it was naturally growing here. And so we are just like that. Part of that, if you start to listen to the TRC and the calls to action, there's a lot about child welfare. There's an entire section on child welfare. I implore you to read it. There's this call that we have parenting programs that are culturally safe and secure. And that's where I implore you to take that on and to be part of that. I also think that it's important for you to look at the other calls to action if you haven't, and go beyond this report. I know In Plain Sight was intended for healthcare providers, but I think In Plain Sight is also very relevant to children, because it's showing you how the healthcare system is or isn't treating Indigenous people. And if you get a chance, the VENS Commission from Quebec is also very relevant, because it's about social services and how social services in Quebec for Indigenous people are very racist. We can't be smug in Ontario and think it's not happening here. And that's something that I often repeat. It's happening everywhere. We just, in some provinces, it may be not as noticeable, but it's still happening. So when you start to think about what can we do to be resistant, well, back at the beginning, I told you about culture, and it's important for us to bring culture back. And when I say back, it's not like it's been ever gone, but to make it more ever present. When you're working in your communities, find out with your local fire department how you can have a ceremonial fire. Invite your Indigenous community to come and do a ceremonial fire or a sacred fire on your premises, because there's not a lot of places that will allow us to do this. Let us have a drumming circle outside. Why not? It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt your community. And in fact, it's a great place for us to learn together. And I think it's easy for you to do. Having elders coming in and talking to not just parents and families, but talking to your children. Even if they're non-Indigenous, I think sometimes their stories are some awesome stories. Some of them are really good at storytelling. And some of them have some great stories. They're not scary stories either. So, they might be great to have a parent-toddler time with them. We do have some statistics for this. So the First Nations Information Governance Center does every few years the regional health survey for First Nations specifically, who live on reserve. And the last time they did this was in 2016. So the results that I have here are 84% of caregivers agree or strongly agree that it's important to have cultural events in a child's life. And so why am I telling you this? Well, because we need to bring this into everything we do. And if we don't do this, then we're not going to be able to pass it on for generation to generation. Culture and language by Head Start attendance, just so you know, it's interesting to take a look that, takes part in traditional activities at least once a week outside of school hours. For those that attended Head Start, it's almost a quarter of them. For those that didn't, only 7%. So Head Start does have a benefit to helping First Nations children feel like being engaged with their cultures and their languages. So if we needed any validation that it's a good program, we've got it here. It does exist. And again, when you look at youth, similarly, this is again showing that if you attend Head Start, it actually helps you to be involved with your culture and language. Yeah, sure, Yvette. You know what? I think that there is a conversation to be had about having a fire. And so I have lots of people who are working on lots of different policy drives. So I think what we need to be doing is showing what a ceremonial fire is. It's not a bonfire you would have up at your cottage. It's usually a log or two. Like, we're not talking 5-foot high flames. We're talking like 2 or 3. I think that that's the other thing, is if we could explain what us, in conjunction with your local communities, explain what ceremonial fire is to the fire marshal or to the local fire station, I think they would get it and they'd be okay with it. I think what's happening is, like, I know the city of Toronto is actually having a what do you call it, consultation with Indigenous people about having sacred fires in different places in the city, in parks. And part of the reason for that is so that they can say, we designate this space so that you can have it at any time. You could just, tomorrow we need to have a sacred fire because somebody passed away. So for the next 4 days, this is going to burn, and you would have a place to go. And I think that we need to be doing that in every city so that we're not waiting till, somebody's passed and we want to have a ceremonial fire or sacred fire. And somebody goes, oh, well, we got to get a hold of the city. No, we shouldn't have to. We know we're not going to burn it. We have fire keepers. This is their job. They learn how to keep the fire so that it doesn't go outside its parameters. And they're very used to doing this. We have tons of fires every year, and we've never had a problem. We're not climate change, and we're not in BC where they're cutting down half the forest and leaving, stubs that are actually flammable. So I think that's the kinds of things you need to talk about at the local level. Yeah. And lots of families should be wanting to go out and do this and learn. And I think that by having Indigenous elders and communities come out and do teachings around a fire is also a nicer way for us to get into conversation, instead of it feeling so much like I'm trying to teach you something and you're trying to resist, or, I'm listening and I'm very skeptical. If you're part of it and you're feeling it and it's experiential, it's more likely that people go, hey, now I get why they do what they do. And I think that's the other piece. So again, I was just talking about, Head Start does have a difference. So please keep doing Head Start. I want to keep seeing these kinds of numbers. So what's happening? Well, you guys are happening. CPMP is happening. The Urban Aboriginal Healthy Living Program is happening. There's school-based nutrition programs happening. I just graduated a PhD student. He's no longer a student, a PhD who does land-based education for early childhood educators, Dr. Hopi Martin. And he's doing it all over Toronto. So, I can gladly put you in touch with him, but he created his entire thesis around how to have ECAs and ECEs understand how to go out into the bush and use the bush as a way to teach children. It's a wonderful program that he's created. It's at Courtright Center right now. He has a wigwam up there. I highly recommend it. And I think that it's important for you to think about for your programs. Don't just take the classroom activities and stuff them outside, but actually using nature to be the teacher. So his dissertation was land as teacher, land as first teacher. And I think that's really important. We all should be thinking about that, especially with climate change on the fore, because this is how we're going to change it. There are policies at the federal and provincial governments that are slowly changing what we provide in terms of support for early childhood development and early childhood education. But the funding is still not where it needs to be. It should be long-term funding. I've been saying and advocating for this since 1999. Nothing's changed. I hope my voice gets louder the older I get. Because if we're only going to give CAPC, CPMP, and Head Start 3 to 5 years of funding, that's not long enough to do any longitudinal changes. I think we need to have 10-year agreements, in the sense that 10 years gives you enough time to, create a timeline, actually live up to it. Whatever changes, you look for other funding or partners to come in with you. And then as you're coming to the end of that 10, you have some legitimate evaluation materials in order to show the government the successes. And I'm pretty sure for every one of your programs, the successes that you've had. Because I can't remember a program when I was working with CAPC, CPMP that was not busting their hump to work for communities. So in terms of Indigenous content, I think that even if you don't think you have Indigenous children and families in your groupings, I think you should rethink that possibly, because there are always Indigenous families who sometimes they don't wish to identify. There could be a variety of reasons, but we can't force them to identify. And so always think like they're there, because it's not going to hurt non-Indigenous people to learn this stuff anyway. So always think like they're there, and it will be helpful in the future. So what's next for Indigenous early childhood development? Well, if we're looking at the East, which is where new beginnings start, I think we have to start thinking about full self-determination and self-governance. And we have to start rethinking our existing structures, our when we look at child welfare, I'm not saying it's individuals, but I think the system itself was inherently set up to take instead of to do like an alternative dispute resolution kind of deal. I think there's a lot to be said there. I think we could do a lot of change there. And I also think that there's a lot to be said in terms of Indigenous childhood, early childhood versus non-Indigenous. Not that they're not similar, but I think there's some learnings that could be had specifically from First Nations early childhood into non-Indigenous, and that could happen readily and easily if we just tried to get that out into the world. I have a book that I really, really, really need to finish. I started a few years ago and never got back to, on Indigenous early childhood development and education. And part of the reason I did that was because I'm forever trying to explain to people that our families are different. I'm always trying to explain to people that attachment theory that is in mainstream education for ECEs and ECAs doesn't necessarily work for Indigenous communities. So there's a lot that needs to be done so that we can start to look at what's working, what's not working. Somebody needs to go and write, which I also have on the plate, and Blanket's going to kill me later, is a paper about CAPC and CPMP and the history of it. You guys have done tremendous leaps and bounds of work over the last 25, 30 years, and it's not really out there in the academic literature. So somebody's always trying to reinvent the wheel instead of looking at best practice and getting it out into the world. We do need to look at this act. It's not been fully implemented, in my opinion. They say they want this to happen as a federal government, but it's not actually happening in a way that is open. So the idea is they were trying to get to a point where First Nations children were being provided the support and services they needed for their families, but I'm not sure that the data is getting picked up and done in the way that they anticipated. I have, however, been working with Dr. Nancy Young and, well, she's not there anymore, but Mary Jo Wabano, who was at Wacomiquan's Health Center. They created HM, which is the Aboriginal Children's Health and Wellbeing Measurement Tool, so HM. And this is a great tool, but it's only in select communities right now. And they started to make changes to it 2 years ago before Laurentian University had a problem. And that's why it hasn't, I think they're trying to work behind the scenes at the moment. But, you know, this tool allows you to see in real time, you know, where are children, young children. And I've been working with Nancy because this is for 6 to 9 year olds, and I want her to have a version that's better or like more for early childhood, because I said to her this would be a really great tool to have for 3 to 6 year olds, because we need to start understanding their feelings and what they're experiencing so that we can actually help them, because we don't know that yet. And my thoughts are that this would also help in terms of feeling like they're being heard at a younger age. And the younger we go, the better it is, because then we start to hear their voices and their voices can come through in our programming. So my recommendations to you, so those are my daughters when they were tiny and my mom when she was young. I miss when they're young, because now they're big. I love them, but I miss when they're little. We need to increase the training and knowledge of Indigenous family structures. So I know I spent an awful lot of time on that this morning, but I hope that you can see that they're different than what I experience when I work with mainstream. That we have to build lifelong relationships with Indigenous peoples or organizations and communities. It can't be a one-off, here's an email, here's a phone call, let's do this one project together and I'll see you later, and you never talk again, or you talk once in 6 years or something. We have to make it a much better effort at trying to have long-term relationships. We need to increase, and when I say research, that can be evaluation of your programs as well. Increase research buy-in for Indigenous early childhood learning and development. And I say this in all fairness because there's not a lot out there. I know there's a lot in BC. There is almost none in Ontario and Quebec when we look at Indigenous early childhood. Actually, and in all fairness, I think there's almost zero on CAPC, CPMP, and Head Start anywhere east of British Columbia. So if we really want to truly make a difference, if you truly want to have the federal government continue to run these programs, they'll want evidence-based, and we need to get that to them. And don't forget, policies, programs, and research aren't just for, you know, somebody to do something, but they are for the future. They're for our children, because if we don't have that, governments will not continue to buy into early childhood development. They won't see the need. So I strongly recommend that you think about what kind of evaluations you're doing and how you're doing them and who's doing them for you. The picture on the right, I just want to highlight a friend of mine, Dr. Brenda Wastaskut, took it in the summer when she was at Brandon Indian Residential School. They put up these hearts for the mass graves. The picture on the left is the Credit River. Why am I telling you this? Because we have a long way and we've got to paddle up that river. We got to be like the salmon, and we've got to come up river, and we're going to fight all these obstacles to get to where we need to go for those children that have passed. There's been tons of Indigenous children who have lost their lives, not just at residential schools, but in child welfare, in other harmful situations. And so we've got to take the time to figure out how we're going to rectify that. So with that being said, I'm done presenting my slides. I'd love to hear questions and have a conversation with everybody.
Hi, Angela.
Hello.
Hello. You know, I had a little bit of a tech issue, so I didn't see if you saw the question from Yvette in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, good. Because that was just when my screen went a little wonky and I had a little panic attack here.
Oh,
But
that's okay. No, I think I answered it. Did I, Yvette? Like for the ceremonial fire, or do you feel like you want more of an answer?
excellent. Wonderful. Now, again, Angela's invited, questions if you want to come on camera or unmute yourself. I'm sure that would be fine. We have a couple of minutes left in our time together. I see some gratitude for you in the chat as well, and for the event. So that's awesome.
There's no name for the book because I haven't finished writing it.
Well,
it's on my long to-do list. Actually, it's over here on my long to-do list. I have not got to it, but it is necessary.
I actually have a question for Angela. I'm just wondering what your sense is of what you've heard, any feedback from your work in the communities about Jordan's principle and how it's going, because I hear different, different feedback, and just wondering what you're hearing.
So depending on where I am, I'm finding that in some communities, they're getting Jordan's principle, because it was opened up with a court case I think 2 years ago. It's not just for children now, it's for youth as well. So any child or youth who needs something, they're supposed to be able to get it. But I'm still finding there's a lot of pushback. And in fact, the federal government fought a 16-year-old who needed braces just like a year ago. And they spent $100,000 in court cases to not spend $10,000 in dental care. So that tells you a lot about this.
Yes. It hasn't moved too far forward. Yeah.
No. And then I'm hearing other people where in community they needed something. I forget what it was. It wasn't very big. It was like a few $100s, but they didn't have the funding. And the band went to try to get them the money through Jordan's principle. And they were told that it was ineligible expenses.
Okay.
But it was a necessary thing, like something they actually needed. So I'm not sure that it's actually working the way that it was intended to work, because the feds were supposed to pay and then worry about responsibility of funding after the fact.
Yeah. Yep.
I think. Oh, sorry. I just want to say I'm seeing a couple of folks asking about the slides, and Angela has graciously provided a copy of them to me, so I can send out a link to them in a follow-up email. Blanca, you were saying?
No, I was going to say the same thing, that it's great that Angela is going to be sharing slides, which I loved how you used your pictures, your family pictures. That was amazing. And the connection to all the teachings and ceremonies.
There were so many things that stood out to me in this in your presentation, and I'm just really, really grateful. And I think for sure one thing that's going to keep clanging around in my head is your invitation or consideration of the phrase of vulnerable children, and recognizing that children are made vulnerable. And I think that really invites us to always be thinking what is the cause and what is going on. So definitely, for sure, we'll take that forward with me, along with many other things that I just want to dive more rabbit holes with you about. So hopefully we can have more conversations, Angela.
Oh, definitely. And like I said, the made vulnerable thing, I got sick of hearing people calling it at risk, marginalized, vulnerable. Right. And I started to realize you as a person aren't at risk, marginalized, or vulnerable. Right. You're made into that direction. So I've started to use that language of made vulnerable. Right. So the made vulnerable population, the made vulnerable people. That makes us think, because it's us that have put them there, right?
Right, exactly. Well, any final words, Angela, as we're wrapping up? here?
Just, I implore you, if you want to be there, if you want to see CAPCC, PNP, and Head Start go for another 25 or 30 years, do invite researchers in, do evaluations. And it doesn't have to be just evaluations, but do have some research about your programs, because governments look for evidence to figure out what they're going to fund.
Mhm.
And I know you're doing great work.
Mhm.
So I want to make sure that you're also doing the other side of it and showing what great work you're doing.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge, yes, we've recorded this, and I will have the link on WebConnects and in the newsletter. And I want to thank everybody for joining us, and Blanca as well, for our partnership in putting this together. And I'll maybe hand things over to you, Blanca, for any final words or comments.
Thanks, Sydney. I also want to thank you, Angela. That was amazing, as I knew it would be, as always. It's, of course, heartening to hear that we have failed in many ways, and continue to fail our kids, our Indigenous children specifically. So I always say when we've had our regional National Child Day events, that National Child Day, it's a good day, to celebrate children and those that work for children, our advocates, but also to reflect and to learn. And we certainly have done that today. But also it's a call to action because there's so much work to do. There's so much that we have to advocate for our children. I was at an event yesterday, a National Child Day event, and they did a poll. There were quite a few kids and youth present. And one of the questions was whether they knew that they had rights, that whether they knew about the convention and whether they knew that they had rights. And the majority of their responses were that they knew very little, that they didn't really know what their rights were. So, that was, I just felt like we have to really, like Angela said, start very little, at a very young age, asking them, how are you feeling? And also letting them know what their rights are. So I really appreciate everyone joining today and all your work. You are there for our kids and our families every day. So, these programs wouldn't be what they are without you. So thank you so much. I hope that you're able to attend your local National Child Day events or in your organizations or with the kids in your family, in your community. So happy National Child Day and enjoy. Thanks for coming.
Enjoy. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I hope we'll see you all again soon.
And thank you, Sydney. Thank you so much for all your support.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for organizing.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.